Hi, I'm Roy Hudson. Stand by for Sean. It'll make your day bright.
Welcome to Look Around Florida. I am your host, Sean McFall, aka the Florida Man. Uh, when you join the show in the comment section, please let me know who you are and what you represent. I love all you. So I got Thomas Jesse. He's in the background right now. Tonight's topic will be Robert E. Lee in the state of Florida. Interesting topic. Not too many people know that he was in Florida. So with that, we're going to give it a little time for the show to get populated. I heard from our division chaplain a little bit ago. They're having an executive board meeting right now, so they'll be joining us here shortly. So, a lot of cool projects coming up. I want to get this out there. Attention Fort Clinch event, October 12th through the 13th, 2024. Looking forward to see this garrison event at Fort Clinch. I have been to the site before and it's been amazing. Part of the event, and we'll be making it types. Below is the brief encouraged description for the garrison. This encouraged but not required. Encourage officers' colors: cadet frock, dark blue kepi, dark blue trousers, slouch hat, sack coat, and shell jacket. Officer social, please wear at least a waistcoat or a jacket that you may leave open to gather. Enlisted, plain frock, sack, shell coat, overshirt, dark blue, light gray. If you have any questions, please wait. Please hit up David. So welcome, Linda and Roy and Jeffro in the house. Let me go back to what I was talking about. The 5th annual Stonewall Jackson Shootout, September the 23rd, 2024 at 6 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. at the Skyway Trap and Ski, 3200 74th Ave, St. Pete, Florida. Skyway Trap has given us membership prices this year. $14.50 ammo, 25 shells, must use steel shot. $5 targets, $10 gun rental. If you have any questions on this event, please get a hold of Rick Gray, the man, the myth, the legend. All right, we got this event coming up. Cal Cavalry Camp 2081 Christmas Party, November the 30th, 2024. Saturday, November 30th, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the American Legion, 2124 American Legion Drive, Arcadia, Florida. Come join us. Food, fun, and fellowship. Be a 50-50 donation support of the Order of the Confederate Rose, Chapter 24. Civil War bingo and other games. I've been going to this event for the past 2 years. It's fun. Fellowship, all that stuff. The 28th SCV Mechanized Cavalry Annual, June the 19th through the 22nd, 2025 at Traverse, Florida. Host Hotel. I know some of this changed. I'll get with Sergeant Nichols to see what has changed on there. The prices have not changed for the t-shirts, all the food and all that. But it is in Traverse, so please reach out to Sergeant Nichols of the Florida Mechanized Cavalry. And our division commander Calvin Hart just sent me these pictures on the monument that they're putting up there at the flag site in Jacksonville. They take them down, we put them up. I know you can't really see the picture that well, but behind the flagpole is the monument. There you go. There's a better picture for you. So it's getting there. It's they have a few more things to do. So what? Excuse me. They got bronze plaques and a whole bunch of other stuff to do. So at least it's a little bit, some progress on the monument there in Jacksonville. We got Beth and Kim. Oh, you did make it, Kim. I thought you were going to be at your executive board meeting. Guys, I got Thomas Jesse in the background. He's going to be coming up here shortly. Make sure you share these episodes out. Jerry Peacock in the Villages. Welcome to the chat tonight, Jerry. Oh, that's a live model. Okay, thanks, Kim. I'm like, man, they really cleaned up that statue real good. So, who volunteered for tribute, Kim? So, did Calvin volunteer for tribute, Kim? We got 9 people showing. I know more people is going to be joining. I guess. I can only imagine, Kim. All right. Let's give a warm welcome to Thomas Jesse, also known as Robert E. Lee in Florida.
Good evening, Sean.
Good evening, sir. You having a good night?
I had a good evening. I know we're going to talk about Robert E. Lee in Florida.
Yeah.
I should tell you that many years ago, an alleged county historian in Tampa told me Robert E. Lee never set foot in Florida. And one of his competitors, who also claimed to be a great historian of that area's history, told me the closest he came was Egmont Key, but he never went anywhere else in Florida. Well, over the years, I've discovered that they really didn't know what they were talking about. Now, compared to where he went, say, in Virginia, he didn't come here a lot, but he did come here, and every visit he made was important. So if you'd like me to tell you about some of it, I'll be happy to.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, the first time, his first experience seeing Florida was on a ship. He was traveling from New York to Mexico during the Mexican War, late 1846. And actually, his visit to the coast of Florida would have changed history a little bit, because as the ship was going through the Florida Straits, a hurricane, what they call a gale, struck the ship, and it almost went down. So imagine, he wrote his wife and said that they were bounced around like apples in a barrel. And the captain told him afterwards, he said if it had not been a steamship and they were able to keep the engines running, the ship would have been lost. They would have gone to the bottom. But fortunately, that didn't happen. He went on to Mexico, went through the Mexican War, came back, and he stationed in Baltimore, 1848. And he receives now he belonged to what's called the Board of Engineers. And that's the Corps of Engineers had what they considered their best and most talented engineers were on this board. And if they had issues or things they wanted to investigate, or say go to a harbor and decide they need to do something with it, the board would be assembled from wherever these officers were, and they would go and do this, issue a report, and then go back to their regular duties. But he's in Baltimore working on Fort Carroll. And the reason I emphasize he's working in the harbor of Baltimore, and it is going to affect something later on in history. he becomes sick. He gets ill. And all the descriptions of what was wrong with him was that he caught malaria. Now, those of you that read about the Battle of Gettysburg and how Lee was sick at the battles of Gettysburg, if you read all the descriptions of what was going on with him at Gettysburg and to travel up, he was having a reoccurring issue of malaria. Everybody says they pass it off that he had, he had diarrhea. Well, you read the symptoms of a reoccurrence of malaria, and all the different things that were going on with him are reoccurring from what he caught in Baltimore Harbor. So something from 1848 affects him in 1863. He receives orders to assemble with the Board of Engineers at Mobile, Alabama. He receives the orders in late 1848. Now, for those of you that live in the Bay Area of Tampa, Clearwater, on the Hillsborough River they keep moving it around, so I'm not sure where it is now. There was a historical marker that says Lee visited Fort Brooke in 1848, which is not true. It's wrong. He received orders. At any rate, the Board of Engineers was to survey the entire coast of Florida. And there was a number of reasons for this that essentially affect all of us. When Florida became a state in 1845, the United States government gave them hundreds of thousands of acres of property, hundreds of thousands of acres of land that the state would sell to generate funds to run the state. Except the U.S. government kept anything that didn't touch the mainland of Florida. So all the islands, all the keys, all the little inlets and things that all went around Florida all still belonged to the United States. And by 1848, the Florida government wanted the United States to determine what are you going to keep and what can we have. And you also had squatters going out on some of these keys and islands and just setting up their houses and things and saying, well, we're here now. The government always intended to determine what do we want to keep that would be important to the United States, like a fort or a lighthouse. So they assembled in Mobile, began early January on a schooner called the Phoenix, and went to Pensacola and started right there at Pensacola. Now, fortunately, in Pensacola, all the maps, all the information about the harbor, all the things about the coastline along Pensacola was already established. So they moved pretty quickly there. But what they were reporting on was essentially everything. Like on a river that flows into the Gulf, what goes in and out of that river? What commerce is there? What people are there? How many people are back there in this part of Florida? What are they producing? What are they shipping out? What are they bringing in? How important is that? I'll tell you, you can tell by the name of this report that they're going to submit that it was done by engineers, because the report is a report of the Board of Engineers upon their examination of the east and west coast of Florida from Pensacola Harbor to Amelia Island. Robert E. Lee was assigned as the secretary, so he's the one who's going to write this report up at the end of this survey. So they came down along the coast. Now, when I say survey, they didn't have transits out and all that. They were surveying what was there, what existed, what it looked like, how important was it important or not. When they got down to Tampa Bay, which was Fort Brooke, although I've been told they weren't there very long, that's not really true. And there's a big reason for it. Because in September of 1848, what they called a great gale of 48 hit Tampa Bay and decimated it. They had a brand new lighthouse out on Agmont Key that was completely destroyed. Lighthouse keeper rode it out in a boat tied to a tree after the storm. Now there was 12 foot of water over top of Egmont Key. When the storm was over, he rowed the boat into Tampa, quit his job, and disappeared. So downtown Tampa, which is where Fort Brooke was 12 to 15 feet of water above. So any of this been to Tampa, imagine down in the lower part of Tampa where the city government and county government and all that, it was under 12 to 15 feet of water when the surge came in. Believe it or not, there weren't any casualties, but it wiped out not only the village of Tampa, but it wiped out Fort Brooke. Fort Brooke had been the most important military facility in the country in the 1830s and early 40s when they were fighting the Seminoles. So part of the survey was to determine the damage of the fort and is it going to be worth keeping it? Is it going to be worth rebuilding it? The other purpose, which was personal for Robert E. Lee, was that a Captain John Casey was there at the fort. And John Casey was a classmate of Lee at Fort West Point. They were good friends. They went through all 4 years, graduated the same year, and John Casey went on to be in the military, assigned to Fort Brooke. He stayed there, and he made from just north of Tampa down past Fort Myers incredibly detailed maps of the coastline and all this information on that part of the Florida, that part of the coastline. In fact, they essentially copied his maps in 1855 for the official government maps. If you ever get an opportunity to look at them, because they're signed not only by, they're signed by George Meade, and they give credit to Captain John Casey. There's also, if you go down to Sarasota, a Casey Isle and a Casey Inlet, and those were named after this captain. So it was important to Lee to see him because it was the last time he was going to see him. Unfortunately, John Casey had tuberculosis and passed away in 1855. So they proceeded on down the coast, making these reports, looking at what's important, what isn't. During this time, Lee wrote 5 letters to his family. Now, I'll tell you that because we know they wrote them, and we know that the Lee family in 1949 had the letters, and one gentleman was able to see them and talked about them a little bit. But now we can't find the letters, so I can't read them to see what he was actually telling his wife. He posted one at St. Mark's. He mailed one at, Fort Myers, one at Key West, one at St. Augustine. Also, the delivery time for a letter was about 4 days. So how long does it take a letter these days? About 4 days. Mm-hmm. Nothing much, and this was by ship. By the time they arrived at Amelia Island was first part of March. So they moved pretty quickly on this. It took him a little while to write the report. It was turned in from Savannah, where they went after Amelia Island. From Savannah in the middle of March, 1849. It's 38 pages, all handwritten by Robert E. Lee, and has a wealth of details about what was going on in Florida at that time, 1840, the late 1840s. What kind of settlements were there, what kind of people, what kind of commerce, what was being grown, what was being shipped out. So the other part is that it was identifying places not only to keep for military use, but also for lighthouses. At the time the lighthouse at Egmont Key was destroyed in the hurricane, it was the only lighthouse between St. Mark's and I think Key West on the West Coast. That was it. So another bit of interesting Florida history is that in 1855 and 56, they finally began building these lighthouses that have been recommended in this report. And the officer in charge of this construction program was Captain George Gordon Meade, who you all know of from Gettysburg. You also know that a fort was named after him in Florida, Fort Meade, when he was in here during one of the wars with the Seminoles in the 1850s. And I should mention George Meade and Robert E. Lee were good friends. They had served with General Winfield Scott in the Mexican War. On his staff, they were personally well acquainted. George Meade and his family and Lee and his family were all good friends before the war. Now, Lee goes on back to Fort Carroll. After this report was turned in, he went back to his regular duties. Then, very quickly, I'll tell you, he went early 1850s. He became superintendent of the military academy at West Point. Was there when his eldest son, Custis, graduated first in his class in 1854. And the reason I'm mentioning Custis is that Fort Clinch in Fernandina, his son Custis was an engineer there in the construction of Fort Clinch. And he was there for 3 years, 1854 through 56. And his father and him exchanged letters quite a bit about the construction. So even though Lee wasn't personally in Florida, he was well aware of what was going on in Florida. He took an interest in it, particularly with his son there. But also, when things were slow, or it was called a sickly season for some of the construction on fortifications, he was in Washington at the Corps headquarters doing work for the commander of the Corps of Engineers. And so even though he wasn't here, he was involved in a lot of these projects that were going on in Florida. So he hadn't forgotten Florida. So now we come to the war. By this time, Lee had determined that he would do whatever Virginia did, as we well know. He went into the Confederate service. And in early November of 1861, he was assigned to command the District of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Because, of course, the Union military had shown great interest in the east coast of these states. They wanted the harbors. They wanted to blockade the Confederacy. And his job was to determine what's most important to put your resources in to protect, like harbor in Charleston, the harbor in Wilmington, harbor in Savannah. Unfortunately, he didn't make himself popular there because he has an untold number of places that all these governors of these states want protected, and he doesn't have the resources to do that. So he's got to determine what's most important, and the rest of it, you just have to let it go. In early November, November 20th, he comes down to Fernandina Beach. Fernandina, Amelia Island, in that area to survey what's going on there. He wrote that they should try to save those Fernandina, Amelia Island, except the work there was going very slow. He said, of course, it being hot, but he said that they could not encourage the men to work hard enough to do the work needed to protect the harbor. So now he goes back, he goes up and down the coast from Charleston to Savannah. Should mention on Cumberland Island is the grave of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee. And he does write when he came to Fernandina and Amelia Island, then he went over to Cumberland Island to visit the grave of his father, which he really wanted to do. His father in recent times was reinterred at Washington and Lee. So the whole family's in the crypt at Washington and Lee, including his father and his mother. So he comes back to Amelia Island in January to inspect all that area again. And during that time, on the 13th, he reviewed the Florida troops that were there, which included the 4th Florida Infantry, and reports that the 4th Florida Infantry was very well drilled. However, when he left, he wrote that they were going to have to consider, in fact, he ordered that Fort Clinch be abandoned. By that point, Union ships had already blockaded the harbor, and they were making indications they were wanting to take Fort Clinch. He realized it couldn't be defended, so he didn't make friends with the Florida governor, but he ordered that the fort be abandoned. So now he goes back to Charleston, and then from Charleston he goes back to Richmond, and then he becomes commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. So he does not come back to Florida until much later. After the war, we know, of course, that he went to Washington College. Now, by the time he takes over at Washington College in 1865, late 1865, 66, 67, his health is deteriorating. He's got what we would call heart issues. He's having problems with walking a lot. It gets exhausting. This progressively gets worse. In early 1870, he tells the board of directors of the college that he's considering resigning because of his health. He says he can't walk from his house down the hill to his office without being exhausted. And he has a pain in his chest right here at his heart almost constantly. Now, in those days, you know, the doctors, as he said, he went to all these doctors. They tap on him like he's an old boiler that they're ready to condemn. And they really wouldn't tell him much because they didn't know a whole lot, which was unfortunate. So the board of directors recommend, instead of resigning, why don't you take a trip south in the warmer weather, and you'll have a relaxed trip and you'll feel better. And then when you get back, we'll see how you are. So he's going to, in the spring of 1870, he's going to take this trip from Lexington, and he wants to go to North Carolina when his daughter Annie Lee, who had passed away in 1862, he had never been able to get to her gravesite, and he wanted to visit her gravesite. And he also wanted to go to Cumberland Island again. So they thought, okay, we're going to take this nice, quiet, relaxed trip on a train, and we're going to go down to these places and relax. Well, it turned out to be nothing like that, because once word got out that Robert E. Lee was coming, as you can well imagine, everybody within 50 miles around wanted to be there and see Robert E. Lee. And there were people keeping track of where the train was and telegraphing ahead. And so every town they came to, people were all along the tracks. They were all at the station, politicians, bands. They all wanted to welcome Robert E. Lee. They wanted to take him to dinners. They wanted him to give speeches. So you can imagine how much rest he was getting. Now, he was getting to see a lot of his old soldiers. And he got to see many of his old staff officers, Walt Taylor, and I think Savannah. He got to see Joe Johnson. He got to see all of these men that he was so close to during the war. So he wrote that he was happy to see them, but he was just exhausted. He did stop and get to see Annie's grave, which think in the 1970s, they reinterred her in Lexington with the rest of the family. So she's no longer, there's still a monument there, but she's no longer in North Carolina. So they get down to Florida, and they're coming by ship this time. They come into Jacksonville, and all these people, this huge mob of people, are out on the dock where the ship comes in to see Robert E. Lee. Well, a whole lot of them, in fact, most of them are trying to get onto the ship. And Lee's at one side of the ship, so the ship's tilting over, and the captain comes to Lee and tells him, if you don't do something, the ship's going to tip over. There's just too many people up here on the deck. So Lee goes out to the other side, and they all go that way, and he asks them all to go out, get off the ship, and he stands on the railing. And they said, now this is thousands of people. Everybody is silent. Lee's daughter, Agnes, that was with him, said all you could hear was the water lapping on the ship, as all these people were silent, and they all took their hats off as respect for General Lee. So now he's going down to St. John, up or down, I don't know which way you call that. Somebody from that area will have to tell me. When you're traveling on St. John's and he's going towards Palatka, is that up or down the river? And people in Palatka thought he was coming to Palatka. So there's all these people in Palatka hanging around the dock waiting to see if this ship shows up with Robert E. Lee on it. He stops at a place called Orange Mill, which is owned by Captain Robert Cole. And Captain Robert Cole had an orange groves, and he shipped out oranges, and he had a dock right there. And he was out in the middle of nowhere. So when the ship stops, Lee gets off, and it's just him and the Cole family and his daughter. And everybody down the river is at Palatka waiting for Robert E. Lee. He never planned on going to Palatka. So he got about 4 days of rest and quiet, wrote his wife about how beautiful it was and how he could go out and pick oranges off a tree and have them for breakfast. So then he travels back, and it was almost the same trip back to Lexington. He told his wife, he said, except for the people he got to see, and it did him well to see how many people had respect for him. He said he wished he had never gone because it wasn't any rest for him. One of his old officers said it was like a farewell tour for Robert E. Lee, because that was in the spring of 1870. The end of September in 1870, he suffered what we would call a stroke. He laid in bed for several weeks, and October 10th, he passed away from what you would call complications, which was pneumonia. So the visits he made to Florida, to me, were very important for Florida, not necessarily, say, for some other state. But also, for those of you to do research, I will tell you this. The report that Lee wrote, a gentleman that did research on this in the 1940s got a copy of the report and then translated it into a typewritten report. He also was given access to those 5 letters I told you about. So he had notes about them, and he said he turned that all over to the Florida Historical Society. Now, as much as I hate to say something about the Florida Historical Society, because they do serve a great purpose, when I went to the Florida Historical Society, they didn't have anything. Now, it's either they don't have it. Now, they've moved around quite a bit. The Historical Society moved from St. Augustine to University of South Florida. Now they're over on the East Coast. It may have been misplaced. They may have lost it, or whoever I was asking was too busy to look for it. But as far as I know, they don't have those things. The letters from the Lee family were given to Stratford Hall, which almost all of the Lee family correspondence is now at Stratford Hall. But if you're familiar with Stratford Hall, it's not a government facility. And it works on donations and it works on people coming to see the place. So what they've been doing is they have a intern on the summers from a college that takes documents from the Lee family and translates them to where you can read them. And of course, 5 letters from Florida don't seem to be that important to anybody. I've tried to find out even if they have them where I could look at the originals, and I haven't got really much of an answer from them. So the information is still out there because Lee liked to write detailed letters to his family telling them all the interesting things he had seen. So I really would like to get those, but right now they're not available to me. So, oh, by the way, when Lee ordered Fort Clinch to be evacuated, about the time they were evacuating and leaving, as the last troops left, that's when the Union troops landed. Marines and sailors came in and occupied Fort Clinch. As they were leaving, they were coming in. So you have any questions, Sean?
Man, I mean, I just learned a lot from you.
Well, I always include the one about him almost going down with the ship because I know he saw Florida. He was familiar with Florida from work he's done in the Corps of Engineers headquarters, you know, the fortifications that were being worked on, Key West and places like that. But the idea that he almost went down with a ship in the Florida Straits, that's got to be connected to Florida.
Yep. Well, I got 2 messages for you. This is from Keith Gruger. He's in Camp 1209.
Well, I see one here. Down is up on the St. John's. The river flows north. Well, I'll leave it at that. He answers my question.
Yep.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate the information.
And this one came in from our AOT councilman.
Oh, Roy Hudson.
Yep.
I'm glad to hear from Roy. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I like telling people things like that because hardly anybody knows. They think Lee was in Virginia all this time. No, he wasn't.
Yeah,
well, actually, his first assignment as an engineer right out of West Point was Savannah, out of where Fort Pulaski ended up as Fort Pulaski. When he was there as an engineer working at Fort Pulaski, it wasn't named Fort Pulaski, and it was a big swamp. And he spent his time in the swamp trying to drive piling to hold up this giant brick fort. So he was down along the coast. We just can't find that he was there any other time than what I just told you.
Ready. We got a couple more messages for you, sir.
Well, the other part for everybody out there. For the information I've given you, if it sparks an interest and you want to do some further research, please do. Please. And as much as we talk about George Meade being on the Union side and being at Gettysburg, he was active in Florida in the 1840s and 50s. Fort Meade down there was named after him. There's a road going east and west out of Fort Meade that was surveyed, and the original road was built by George Meade. And a lot of the lighthouses that you see, he was the supervising engineer on these projects. So he has a foot in Florida too, even though later on he went with the Union.
All right, we got one question came in for you.
Okay. Well, Lee said after the battle that as well as anybody can see, if General Jackson had been there, they would have won the battle. When you're considering Gettysburg and you're considering what Lee did, you need to think of this. Chancellorsville was just a few months before that. He lost Jackson, which he called his right arm. He had Longstreet, which is his left arm. He had reorganized his army, put 2 new officers in command of Army Corps, and took off to Pennsylvania. Now, he had his reasons for doing that. When the battle began, now, here's an important part about when you read about these battles, and this is for everybody, and we all do it. We know the rest of the story, and we're going to judge these people on what we know. Now, Lee didn't know on the first day. You have to take, what did he know on the first day? What did he know on the second day? What information did he have? And one of the things you're going to find out is that some of the information he was getting was wrong. Not deliberately wrong, but it was wrong. The third day, all by everything he's looked at, it was the only course of action. Without doing the third day, if he tried to retreat, he would have been attacked by Meade, all strung out along the roads. If he had tried to go around like Longstreet wanted, his army would have been cut off from their retreat, from where they did retreat. I've heard many people tell me, well, he should have just whipped around there and gone towards Washington. Well, now you need to consider what an army of his size or even Meade's size is like on the roads. You're talking miles and miles of troops strung out along a road. Meade had plenty of cavalry. Up until the third day, Lee had some cavalry. People make a point that Lee had all this cavalry before Stuart was there. Well, he had some cavalry, but their officers, their commanders were not officers that he had a lot of faith in. And probably one of his blind sides was the only person he trusted the information completely was information he got from Stuart. And you might say, well, that blinded him to other people. But you're talking about an officer that had a lot of experience in the Mexican War doing reconnaissance and getting reports from other people and how erroneous all these reports were, including at the beginning of the war in 1861, his experiences in West Virginia. All these people are bringing him all this information. Well, 99% of it was wrong. It was all exaggerated. What he was thinking was he wanted to strike the Union Army and destroy it. He wanted to break it. Another thing to think about in his thinking, the Union Army, from the time he took over the Army of Northern Virginia, had been essentially beaten by the Army of Northern Virginia all the way up through Chancellorsville. They had had 5 commanders, and he calculated that the Army was demoralized, which was true. But he also didn't find out that George Meade was commander until the day before the battle. And he knew George Meade. And he knew that George Meade was a very capable officer. So that changed the whole dynamics of it. But he was thinking he wanted to strike them a blow and break their army and destroy it on Union ground. And he was overconfident about what his army could do. He even said that. He said, "I thought my soldiers were invincible." And when you look at the track record of the Army of Northern Virginia from when he took command of it up until Gettysburg, I can see why he thought that. Look what he did at Chancellorsville. But he also had an army that had 2 senior officers that were in brand new positions, and they were essentially untested in those positions. So I don't know that that answered your question completely, but I'm asking you, consider what information he had. The information he had on where Meade's troops were on the left, where they were on the right, what was to his front. The other thing he calculated on, which is something some people should look into more thoroughly, is the performance of his artillery. A lot more artillery was supposed to be involved in that barrage on the 3rd day. And on his right flank and on his left flank, he had long-range artillery that was supposed to fire on the right and left flanks of the Union Army, and it didn't happen. The other thing through all 3 days was the coordination of the different corps, the different parts of the Army. The 3rd day, Ewell, excuse me, hold on just a second. Ewell and Longstreet's assaults were supposed to take place on certain times, one right after the other, and that didn't happen. In fact, it was terrible the way it happened. There's a very good book written by an author named Stewart called Pickett's Charge, written quite some time ago. But the interesting thing he talks about is time. And when he's talking about time, he says you've got to consider, well, we think about time as instantaneous. I need to tell him something, I pick up something and you tell him right now. What does it take to get a message even from Longstreet down to Pickett? What does it take to get a message from Lee over to Ewell? And consider that, and you even read about some of the ways they'd had to do it. They would usually have to send 2 separate officers, and particularly in an area like Gettysburg where you're not that familiar. And consider that you've got to get there, find the man, find that officer you're trying to get to, and tell him what needs to be done. By the time all that happens, the whole situation probably has changed. If Lee sends an order to Ewell to do a certain thing, by the time it gets to Ewell, everything's different. You have to take all of that into effect. But Lee, what he essentially wanted to do was destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, Army of the Potomac, break the Army on northern ground. The politicians in Richmond were looking at this because of Europe and also because of the coming elections for Lincoln. That if they could have a great victory like that, they just had a great victory at Chancellorsville. Almost completely destroyed the Army of Potomac. Now here they go up into Pennsylvania. They have another great victory. They essentially destroy the Army of the Potomac. Lee said they couldn't afford any more empty victories, so he wanted one that would be the, what would you call, the knockout blow. And like he said, I thought my men were invincible. So for the most part, that's what he was thinking about. You also think from the 2nd day, he knew that the Union line had been broken by the Georgians over there near the Peach Orchard. The line had been broken. If they had been supported, they could have, if there was more troops behind them, but by that time it was too late. They broke the line. If more troops could have been pushed up there, they would have broken Meade's line right there. And he knew that they had done it that day. So he was thinking, if I give it one big push in the center, which this is another part, he's aiming for Ziegler's, what we call Ziegler's Grove, which is a crossroads. You go up to Ziegler's Grove and all these different roads show up, different directions. That's what the goal was, not this little patch of bushes out there in the center. But he thought if he could break the line enough, then the army, the Union Army, being demoralized from all this time of being defeated, that he thought it would work. He thought he could do it. Withdrawing at that time to him wasn't an option. And I agree with him. That answer anybody's question out there?
I think so. We do have a question that came up for you.
I was disappointed in the book. He's asking my opinion of the book Reading the Man. I didn't enjoy the book as much as I thought I would. She made a big thing about she got to read all this documents of the Lee family that nobody had access to. And I thought in that book there will be those things. They weren't. She would give a little bit of it at the beginning of a chapter, and the rest of the chapter was her opinion. And a lot of things that she put in there, and I'll give you one example. Actually, I'll give you two examples. One of the examples in there, she talks about Lee having all this food in camp. People were sending him food all the time. So while his troops were going on half rations, people were sending him all this food, so he was well fed. She doesn't tell anybody that he sent all that food down to the hospitals. And this is all written in descriptions, so many descriptions you can't say it's not true. His officers talked about it. They would get all this food and they're thinking, we're going to be able to have a really nice dinner tonight. And Lee would walk out and have them send it to the hospitals for the wounded. And they would keep maybe a little small bit of it. His main fare at his table was a head of boiled cabbage and sometimes sweet potatoes. Once in a while, in the boiled cabbage was a little tiny piece of bacon. And that was their standard fare. So she leaves all that out. She leaves you with, if you don't know any better, she leaves you with the impression that he was eating all this wonderful food while his men were going hungry. And that wasn't true. So I was disappointed in the book. The other example was she spends a chapter trying to prove the story that shows up in the Union newspaper, a story that they paid money for, about him whipping one of the slaves at Custis Mansion. She goes through all this contortions about all the things she checked. She tried to prove it this way. She tried to prove it this way. She tried to prove it that way. By the end of the chapter, she still hasn't proved that it happened. But she says, well, it rings true, so she believes it. After I read that chapter, I wasn't too sure I wanted to read the rest of the book. There's information in there. When she quotes things that were in these letters, or she gives little bits of information, there's information in there, but you got to dig through her opinion of Robert E. Lee through the whole book. So I wasn't impressed with it.
Hopefully that answers your question, Kim. All right. You were able to answer Jerry's question.
Yeah, Jackson was the missing link.
Yep.
And unfortunately for Lee, his choice of Ewell he had to learn that you had to give specific orders to Ewell. He didn't have to do that with Jackson. In fact, Jackson even talks about it. He says he gave me the general idea of what he wanted, and Jackson would take off and do it. And Ewell was used to be given detailed orders from Jackson, and Ewell could go out and do what he was told to do. But as far as him taking initiative or doing things on his own, he wasn't Jackson. A.P. Hill, excellent officer, but Hill had so many health issues that half the time he wasn't even in command. Now, he was at Gettysburg, but for instance, when you go further up to the Wilderness, half the time at the Wilderness, Hill's back there in an ambulance, sick. Had serious health issues. There's still a debate on what those health issues were. From what I've read, it sounds like he had something problem with his kidneys.
Ready? This question came up.
Well, I don't know that we have enough time to answer this one. Okay, the simple answer is that the Arlington estate belonged to his son Custis. It was his inheritance from his grandfather. It was from his grandfather. It was Lee's wife's as long as she lived, and then it was Custis Lee's property after that. And Custis Lee, I think because he made a promise to his mother more than anything, he pursued it after the war. After his mother died in 1873, it took him until the early 1880s. He had actually went to the federal government and offered to sell it to them. He didn't want it. It's a cemetery now. But he didn't want to just walk off without proving that the federal government had taken it illegally. But he offered to sell it to him, and he goes, "No, it's ours. Go away." So he went to court, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, when it finally got to them, they ruled that the government had acted illegally, basically, essentially stolen the property, and that they had to return it to him immediately. So he could have walked over there the next day and told everybody to get out and start digging up the bodies. He seriously did not want to do that. He sold it to them for $150,000, which is several million today. He turned around and gave his sisters were supposed to get. It's 9 o'clock. Supposed to get a cash settlement in their grandfather's estate. And when a war came, they didn't get that. So Custis took money that he got and he turned around and gave it to his sisters, what they were supposed to get. I'm pretty sure he gave them more than that. And he also received a lot of Washington's memorabilia that they had taken. He received some, and the rest of it, the government paid him more money so they could keep it. Because they had taken all these things that Mr. Custis had kept as George Washington, all these things, swords and all sorts of stuff. So he proved that they took it illegally. It was important because there were other people, and nobody mentions this, there were other people in the same situation as him, especially up in Northern Virginia and some of these other places where the government had walked in and said, well, you're not here to pay taxes, it belongs to us. And so when he won the case, that essentially settled the issue for other property owners. I think there was 4 or 5 up in Northern Virginia that were actually, I don't know if they gave him money to pursue it with the lawyers, but it benefited them too, because it settled their problems with their property. I hope that answered their question there.
I hope so too, because
Sean, I didn't talk too long, did I?
You were perfect, Mr. Jesse. You were perfect. Yeah, that's with me. I'm a little bit under the weather, so you helped me out a lot, and I
Well,
learned quite a bit too.
somewhere down the line, I'll be happy to talk to you again. Talking about Lee after the war is a good one. There's a lot
Ooh,
of things that people don't understand about what happened to him after the war, and you'll also understand why he did or didn't do certain things after the war because of it. I'd be happy sometime down the road later to come back on and talk to you about that.
perfect. Maybe closer to his birthday. Well, you're getting a lot of compliments
Well,
from SCD members and OCR members.
well, I'm glad some people came in and listened. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, me and Mr. Jesse, we go back not only within the SCV, but also in the reenactment community. So if you're looking for a speaker for your camp, hit up Mr. Jesse or his wife Gail, and they can get that scheduled.
Be happy to. Depending on how far away the camp is, I don't have a speaker's fee for Florida SCV, but you have to feed me. So there is that. If you're too far away, then there might be something involved with me staying overnight. But I'll be happy to come talk to a camp, or like we did over in Clearwater. It was, I think it was two camps.
Yeah, the early camp and the
Jackson
Schoolmore
Camp, and there was
Jackson.
another camp there. Well, I'm sorry, there was three camps because the early camp was there.
Yeah, yep.
So I'll be happy to come talk to folks. Many people haven't heard about Lee's life before the war. Definitely, most people haven't heard about his life after the war. And then even during the war, we'll talk about that.
Well, not just that, but yeah, what a lot of us are familiar with what he did in the War of Northern Aggression. Not too many of us know about what he did in the Mexican War. Uh, yeah, I pushed my mic down, so nobody probably heard that. Well, what I was saying is not, yeah, I read a lot about Robert E. Lee during the War of Northern Aggression. I've not seen anything about what he did during the Mexican War.
Well, that's a whole story in itself.
Yeah.
And I did a program up in at the Civil War Naval Museum there in Columbus, Georgia.
Yep.
Which, if you haven't been, folks out there, if you haven't been to that museum, you need to go to that museum. We did a program on the Navy with Lee, the Navy with Grant.
Mm-hmm.
And I focused on the Mexican War, and I told everybody, if you want to understand things that happened during the war in 1861, you need to look at what some of these officers were doing in the Mexican War. Well, I'm going to take it for granted you can still hear me. And the Mexican War is important right from the beginning, where Winfield Scott and the U.S. Navy did a joint operation at Veracruz, joint operation of landing troops, artillery, horses, everything it would take for an army to move into Mexico, plus naval guns for firing on Veracruz Fortress. And they did it, showed that the Navy and the Army can do what we would call a joint operation. And some people learned that lesson and took it to the war between the states, particularly General Grant. If you look at his his operations on the Mississippi, Vicksburg, all those places, the cooperation between the Navy and the Army was the same as what General Scott and the U.S. naval officers, and I can't tell you the name of the senior officer. I have it, but I just can't remember it. So if you want to understand some of the things that happened in 1860s, go back and study the Mexican War. If you want to understand where a lot of these officers made their reputations, like Lee, like Jackson, like, well, Joe Johnson, Pickett, Longstreet, Armistead, the connection between these officers, it all started back there at the Mexican War. On Winfield Scott's staff, where I ended up being essentially his chief of staff, you had Beauregard, George Meade, McClellan. All these young officers were on his staff, all working together. And their experience all then went to the 1860s. So I'll be happy to come and talk to you about the Mexican War sometime.
Cool.
9 o'clock. It's after.
Ready.
Well, you hadn't. Have I talked too long now?
Nope. Yeah, you're perfect. I hear Gary in the background, so.
Well, yeah, I know you disappeared there for a minute, so I thought I needed to do a little tap dance or something here. And
Oh,
if
that's all
anybody's-
right. Yeah.
he's still listening.
Yeah, nature called. So, guys, I know quite a bit of you have already thanked Mr. Jesse for coming on tonight. I learned a lot. Hopefully, you did too. And please share these episodes out. These guys and girls are taking time out to get you the information. So, if you're on
Thank you very
YouTube,
much. Appreciate the invitation. It was an honor. And if one of you out there goes and researches a little more because of something I said, then it was worth me talking to you. Thank you very much. Have a good
all right,
night.
Mr. Jesse, you have a good night. I'll see you soon, sir. All righty. If you like any of these episodes, please share it. We're going to end the show off on a video that Mr. Jesse did a few years ago.
When my mother was in college, she danced with Confederate veterans. To me, it wasn't that far away. You know, my father knew this. My mother knew this. Almost 50 years ago, I joined the Sons of Confederate Veterans. In those days, we weren't concerned about saving monuments or any of those things. That wasn't necessary. In fact, none of us had any remote idea that it would ever come up. We can't just sit there and react. We have to be proactive. Or, as Robert E. Lee said, the best way to disrupt your enemy's plans is to strike first. Everyone should do all in his power to collect and disseminate the truth, in the hope that it may find a place in history and descend to posterity. History is not the relation of campaigns and battles and generals or other individuals, but that which shows the principles for which the South contended and which justified her struggle for those principles. If you're looking for some place to be where you think you're going to accomplish something to save our history, go to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I'm Thomas Lee Jesse. I'm a descendant of Private Daughtery Gilmer, a Confederate veteran.
Thank you all for joining tonight. Stay young, stay out of trouble. May God bless you, and stay Southern. Have a good night, everybody.